Hello, my name is Reagan, and I've recently experienced something profoundly traumatic. Unlike many of you, I've never had a place to truly call home. You see, I'm originally from Mexico, but I immigrated to the United States last year. Growing up, I often heard about the American dream, so when my dad told us we were moving there, it didn't come as a surprise. However, what transpired next turned our family's life completely upside down. Even now, the memories of it send shivers down my spine, and I must be honest with all of you. I sometimes wish we had never made the move. It truly stands as the most significant mistake of our lives. A part of me was mildly curious about the prospect of living in the United States, but deep down, I didn't want to leave Mexico. Our life in Mexico was simple, and I liked it that way. My dad, on the other hand, frequently spoke about the perceived lack of opportunities in Mexico and how we could enjoy a significantly better life by immigrating. His best friend, Luke, had moved to the U.S. a few years earlier and spoke as if living there was the best thing that had ever happened to him. The process had been seamless for Luke and his family. They obtained their visas easily, found a decent apartment, secured good jobs, and enrolled their children in an excellent school. It all seemed so straightforward, didn't it? He assured my dad that our experience would be just as smooth, that once we arrived, we'd live happily ever after, mirroring their success. If only life were that simple. My dad made the decision to go first and stay with Luke until he could arrange everything for the rest of us. Surprisingly, his visa came through relatively quickly, and before we knew it, he was on his way. We dropped him off at the border with just a suitcase full of clothes, promising we'd reunite soon. Mom was understandably emotional because this marked the first time they would be separated since they first met. There were plenty of tears, and I distinctly remember thinking, "Calm down, Mom." I mean, we were only a month away from joining Dad, so why all the tears? It was almost as if she had a premonition of what was to come. Later that day, we received a call from Dad, and everything had gone smoothly. He was already at Luke's house, ready to start his job hunt, and he suggested that we kickstart the visa process right away. He urged us to use the same agency he had employed because they had connections that could expedite the visa approval process. So we followed his advice and engaged the agency's services, and they assured us that our visas would be ready within a month. However, as the month passed, our visas remained elusive. Anxiety crept in, and we worried that something had gone terribly wrong. I experienced a profound sense of fear, but at the same time, a strange kind of serenity. Perhaps it wasn't meant to be. During that month of waiting, Dad took on 2 jobs. One involved stacking shelves alongside Luke at a grocery store, and the other had him driving a cab. He was working practically around the clock. I wondered if we'd even get to see him once we arrived. Finally, our visas came through, albeit with a hiccup. They had bungled our names and had to redo them all. We headed to the border, and it felt like déjà vu. Except this time, we were the ones making the crossing. I went first and encountered no issues. They asked me a few routine questions, like where I intended to live and which school I would attend, but overall, the process was smooth and left me feeling immensely relieved. I mean, you often hear these daunting tales about immigration officials subjecting people to intense questioning. Josel was up next, and his experience went smoothly too. They didn't ask him any questions, mainly because his command of English was almost non-existent. He was just 7 years old at the time, so it was entirely understandable. Then it was Mom's turn. Initially, everything seemed to be going well. It even looked like the immigration officer was flirting with Mom. I saw her laughing. But then something changed. Suddenly, her laughter faded, and she stopped smiling altogether. Two security guards swiftly approached, and one of them was talking on the phone. The next moments passed in a blur as I watched Mom crumble into tears and get escorted away. I started shouting for her, desperately trying to get her attention. She attempted to turn around, but the guards were adamant, escorting her towards an interrogation room. I could hear her cries, and honestly, I felt utterly helpless. I even attempted to cross back into the Mexican side of the border, but we were trapped in a limbo, unable to return. I kept yelling my mom's name until my voice nearly gave out. An hour felt like an eternity, and Josiah and I were utterly devastated. We knew our dad was waiting on the other side, likely filled with worry about our absence. Finally, an immigration officer approached and delivered news that would forever alter our lives. "I'm sorry, kids," he began, "but your mom won't be coming to the U.S. anytime soon. She committed a serious offense a few years ago, so whoever issued her visa did so illegally. There's a significant blemish on her record. I regret having to share this news with you like this, but let's get you to the other side, shall we? I've heard your father is anxiously awaiting your arrival." As she uttered those words, tears began to flow uncontrollably down my face. I felt like I might vomit. How could my mother possibly be labeled a criminal? It had to be some sort of mistake. My mom is a nurse, the kindest person you could imagine. She wouldn't harm a soul. I told the woman that we weren't going anywhere, but she met my gaze with unwavering determination and informed me that we had no choice. Then she uttered something that ignited a fierce anger within me. "I advise you to cooperate here, girl. You don't want to end up like your mother, do you?" My desire to see my dad surged. Did he know what had transpired? What had my mom done? Finally, we made it to the American side, and if I never had to encounter those immigration officials again for the rest of my life, it would be too soon. Both Josiah and I sprinted into Dad's arms, and he instantly sensed that something was terribly amiss. "Where's your mom?" he inquired. I couldn't even find the words to respond, and he understood the truth. His expression plummeted, and I had never seen him appear so broken as he did at that moment. The taxi ride back to our new life was a miserable ordeal. Neither of us spoke, and the silence in the vehicle was so thick you could have sliced it with a knife. It was truly a nightmarish transition. Our familiar life had come to an abrupt end. That first day, I didn't even notice the state of disrepair in our new neighborhood, or that we only had a mattress on the floor to sleep on. Sleep was out of the question anyway. Luke and his wife rushed over, trying to connect us with lawyers, but it all seemed hopeless. Everything felt too raw for me to even ask Dad about what had happened with Mom. But that night, as we lay in bed, he finally decided to share the truth. Before we were born, Mom had been involved in a hit-and-run accident. She had been working a night shift at the hospital and had accidentally struck a young man who was walking in the street. Initially unaware of what had occurred, she continued driving home. However, upon noticing blood on her car, she suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. She had assumed it was all in the past and that it would have been expunged from her record by now, especially since the young man had survived and eventually dropped the charges. But evidently, it was still haunting her. My initial reaction was anger. Why hadn't my mother stopped to help? It seemed so unlike her. But as Dad continued, things began to make sense. I began to understand why she would become jittery and nervous when we drove on certain roads. I felt a deep sense of sympathy for her. An accident that had turned into a crime was now resurfacing and wreaking havoc on her life, and ours as well. Life just seemed unbearably unfair. What were we going to do? Dad expressed his belief that she would never be able to get through the border now. There seemed to be no way. That night, all of us cried ourselves to sleep, clinging to the hope that the morning would bring some good news. Unfortunately, it didn't. Things only took a turn for the worse. In the light of day, I noticed how filthy our new place was and how relentlessly noisy. I suggested to Dad that we should return home and be with Mom. She needed us, but he refused. He believed that we could find a way to bring her here, and in the meantime, we had to start school and build a new life for ourselves. Easier said than done indeed. I can honestly say that the next year passed in a whirlwind of lawyer appointments, homework, and the slow process of rebuilding our lives without Mom. She was back in the village with our entire family, resuming her old job, but she was utterly heartbroken. We all were. During that first year, I hardly made any friends. Instead, I concentrated on achieving excellent grades, determined not to let this entire immigration ordeal be in vain. Josiah, on the other hand, adapted relatively quickly, and soon his English was nearly as good as mine. Dad worked tirelessly throughout the year to secure a better house for us, something with a small garden. And when we finally moved into that new house, I began to embrace my role as the motherly figure in the household. Our determination to bring Mom to the States remained unwavering. Dad collaborated closely with a lawyer, although their efforts had yet to yield success. Some days, I must admit, I contemplated giving up and returning to our homeland where we truly belonged. Then, one day, we received a call from our lawyer. He had stumbled upon a potential loophole that might work in our favor. Dad rushed home from his shift at the supermarket, and we decided to celebrate with a special dinner. I took charge of cooking for all of us, and for the first time in a year, it felt as though we were genuinely happy. As I began washing the dishes afterward, a crashing sound echoed through the house, like the shattering of glass. I raced into the living room to find Dad with his head in his hands. At first, I couldn't comprehend what had happened, but when I peered out of the window, I caught sight of a gang of boys speeding away in his taxi. They had robbed us. We called the police, but it was futile. There was nothing they could do. It felt as though, for every step forward we took, we were forced to take 2 steps back. Dad was utterly devastated. That's when it struck me that this was unsustainable. We were living in a vast bubble of uncertainty, pretending that everything was fine, but the one thing we yearned for more than anything was to reunite with Mom. And the only way to make that happen was to return home. Despite all the efforts my dad had exerted to make our immigration dream a reality, we came to the harsh realization that it was a lost cause. The theft of his cab, as if it were a sign, was the final straw that prompted us to make the decision to return. You know what? I don't regret it for a single moment. We gave our all, truly. But a life without Mom just wasn't the life we wanted to lead. Now we are back in Mexico, and the American dream feels like nothing more than a distant and haunting nightmare.